Unfortunately, we don't have to look very far in the news or even in our own communities to find examples of really scary and dangerous things happening in our world. These might be things like natural disasters like hurricanes or wildfires, or maybe domestic violence or mass shootings, or maybe even just the sudden loss of a loved one. And when we experience these things, we can often feel helpless and afraid. We call many of these types of experiences traumatic, and they shape how our brains and bodies react to the world around us. And we now know even more about how these experiences affect young children and how they learn and grow. So what is trauma? Trauma is a situation of threat of injury or death to an individual or someone that they love, where the response to that situation is one of fear, helplessness, or horror. Traumatic experiences often overwhelm our coping skills and cause our biological threat response systems to stay on, often for prolonged periods of time. In other words, sometimes we refer to trauma as too much for too long with too little support. It's also important to note that trauma is in the eye of the person who is experiencing the situation. So we on the outside might look into a person's experience and label something as traumatic, but if that person has coping strategies and people to rely on to help them recover, they might not internalize that as a traumatic experience. Conversely, we might look in another person's situation and think, that doesn't seem that bad. I wonder why they're reacting this way. But in reality, perhaps because of previous experience or lack of access to the supports that they need to recover from the situation, that individual may feel that those experiences are traumatic. So we must use what people tell us and show us about their experiences as the evidence as to whether or not a particular situation is traumatic to them. Why is trauma a problem long term? Experiencing trauma early in life is problematic for a number of reasons, and the first I'll discuss here is called wear and tear. So when our body's stress response system stays active for too long, it can cause wear and tear on the brain and the body. We know from research with the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that individuals who reported having higher numbers of traumatic experiences earlier in their lives also reported higher incidences of physical and mental health issues later in life. Furthermore, other research has found that stress can actually change the way that your genes are expressed. And emerging research has found that these changes to our stress response system can actually get passed down across generations. The second reason that stress is so problematic early in life is that young children are still learning how the world works and are building their expectations for the future. And young children learn a lot about their own safety, about who they can trust, and what they can expect from the world around them within the context of the relationships they have with their caregivers. Now, if they're learning from their caregivers that they are safe and can explore the world and have their needs met, they're more likely to learn how to rely on others and build effective coping strategies for the future when things get hard. However, if children are learning that they can't really rely on adults for help and they can't regularly get their needs met, they start to internalize that the world is a hostile and unsafe place and that other people can't be trusted. Lastly, early in life, young children are learning strategies for keeping themselves safe and are packing their bags full of these strategies. So for example, some research has suggested that children with a history of physical abuse may be more sensitive than their peers to the expression of anger in faces. And this makes sense. They are probably more exposed to anger and have more practice in recognizing it. But they've also learned that being able to quickly recognize anger can mean the difference between getting hit and getting to safety. And then they may put that escape strategy in their bag and bring it with them into the classroom, into their neighborhoods or communities, and use it whenever they sense anger in the faces of others. And you can probably see that though that strategy protects them in one context, it can be really disruptive in another. And so we come to this issue of challenging behaviors. How is trauma reflected in children's challenging behaviors? Though as adults we can articulate our experiences using words, young children don't always have the vocabulary to express what's scary or stressful to them. And because children can't always describe with words what's happening to them, we have to rely on their behaviors to tell us. And there are a number of different types of challenging behaviors that we often see in children who have experienced trauma. Some of these include hitting, biting, kicking, swearing, throwing, running, freezing, arguing, blaming others, hostility, refusal to follow rules, blatant disobedience, yelling, hiding, self-injury, lashing out at others, shutting down, and disconnecting from physical senses. Now, one of the most compelling statements I've heard from professionals in the field who work with children who have experienced trauma is this: behavior is communication. So when children are feeling especially fearful or overwhelmed, they actually revert into survival mode of fight, flight, or freeze. And with their bag full of strategies for how to cope with those threatening situations, they're actually trying to regain control when they feel out of control. Because feeling out of control is really scary, especially when the world around you is unpredictable and has proved to be unsafe in the past, and you don't think you can rely on adults to help you. So when children are showing these different types of fight, flight, and freeze behaviors, what are they actually trying to tell you? With fight behaviors, they're saying, I feel out of control, so I'm going to fight you for control. In the case of flight behaviors, they may be saying, I'm afraid and I have to escape from this situation to stay safe. And in the case of freeze behaviors, they're communicating, I'm stuck and I can't do anything because my body is frozen in fear. So how do we help children who have experienced trauma? It can often feel like when you're working with a child who's experienced trauma that they're misbehaving just because they're out to get you, or they're being malicious, or they're just looking for attention. And as the adult, that can be really, really frustrating. But the reality is that in a lot of these cases, children are just trying to communicate that they need your help in order to stay safe and feel okay. Now, there are a number of ways that we can help children who have experienced trauma early in life, and these are just a few. First off, take a deep breath. Addressing challenging behaviors is really hard work and can often push our own emotional buttons. Sometimes we need to take a few deep breaths to regain control over ourselves before we try to engage with young children. Connection before correction. So when a child is out of control, offering to help them calm down is not giving in to their demands. Helping them to calm down is a form of connection and relationship building that builds trust. And then when they're calm, they're in a better place to hear you and to talk through their behavior. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I'm feeling really emotional and upset, that's not really a good time to try to teach me things. So when a child is really upset or out of control, you might crouch down on their level and say something softly like, I see that you're really mad, and I'm going to stay here with you and help you calm down. Name it to tame it. Here we're helping children begin to understand their own emotions by naming them. Often children who have experienced trauma haven't had a lot of practice in describing or understanding their own emotions in the context of words. They may not be able to identify basic emotions or describe the degrees or differences between different emotions. But as humans, language is an essential tool to help us understand and communicate our thoughts and our feelings. And so the more we can begin to identify and talk to children about different kinds of feelings, the more they can begin to name them and tame them. Smelling and cooling the soup. This is just one example of how to talk about healthy coping strategies that we use as adults, but using kid language. When we smell and cool a soup, it's a model of deep breathing, which is perhaps the quickest and most effective way to calm our biological stress systems. So these are just a few examples, but the good news is that there are now a ton of great resources out there on trauma in childhood and how adults can help children cope. I've got some recommended resources linked down below in the description section, and I'll also put a plug in here for the Resilience Toolkit I made with my colleague Tracy Schreifels. The toolkit includes some more in-depth information about working with acting out, shutting down, and defiance behaviors specifically. In some of the videos included in the Resilience Toolkit, one of which you can watch right over here, Tracy actually shows some of these strategies in action, and then we break down how they work and why. So more information about that and how to get your copy down below. So what about you? What have you found helpful to keep in mind when you're working with children who have experienced trauma? What other tools and resources would you recommend to others? Tell me all of that down below in comments, and as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.